Many thanks, of course, to the organizer for organizing this brilliant conference and for permitting me also to escape a little bit the harsh reality of the Polish winter. So it's really agreeable to be here in Madrid and not anymore in Warsaw, at least for some days. As you know, it's the period of fasting that is starting now. And as you know, we all have to suffer, and I will try to help you this evening with suffering, not only by presenting a thoroughly depressing conference and speech, but also by delaying the moment of dinner you probably all are waiting for by another 15 minutes or so. So my talk will be about disruption and restoration, a blueprint for the political future of Christianity in Europe. A renewal of Europe in the spirit of its centuries-old Christian tradition is an image conjured up in conservative circles everywhere in the West for decades by now. And yet it often seems not only that we have hardly come a step closer to this hope, but rather that we are moving further and further away from that goal. The degree of moral and spiritual corruption of the West is reaching new, undreamt of dimensions every day. And in the meantime, not only its moral health and economic stability are threatened, but also its very survival as an independent civilization. And this not only because of mass immigration from outside Europe, but much worse, because of the Europeans' inner estrangement from their Christian heritage and thus the very essence of their civilization. Admittedly, Western traditions also draw on sources other than Christian ones. One need only think of the Greco-Roman or the pre-Christian Celtic, Germanic and Slavic tradition. And the Church itself has long since transcended the European continent and taken fertile roots elsewhere. But European Christianity and Western identity have such broad intersections from a historical perspective that for many centuries, people have been inclined to speak even of identity. And it is clear that one cannot uproot the one without destroying the other. We need not look only at the unrests of 2020 and 2021, when under the pretext of solidarity against an allegedly systemic racism, violent clashes broke out in the United States and spread to Europe, resulting not only in looting and physical aggression, but also in the systematic damaging and destruction of our Western cultural heritage. For years, even decades, the West has been marked by a tragic inner self-destruction, in which some of the most valuable traditions of our civilization, charity, tolerance, introspection, have detached themselves from their spiritual roots, have been annexed and disfigured by progressives, and are now, so to speak, leading themselves ad absurdum, as they have abandoned their transcendental anchoring. At the same time, most conservatives seem utterly perplexed by the current evolution and, given the tightening of an ever more oppressive political correctness, become easy prey to liberalism, ignoring that it was precisely the idea of laissez-faire and of moral norms only based on the idea of harming no one and negotiating consensus that were at the very root of the present corruption. To establish a middle ground between liberalism and leftism, we have to commit to what I've called Hesperialism and present it together with a series of colleagues such as Albino Mario, such as Chantal Del Sol from all over Europe in our book Renovatio Europae. Hesperialism draws its name from the typically Western Faustian longing for what is beyond the horizon, for utopian places such as the Hesperides, Atlantis, Avalon, Utopia, or Valinor, and is characterized as well by a positive commitment to the historical traditions of the West and thus to Christianity, as by a political strive for constructive unification of the European nations beyond EU bureaucracy and nationalistic narrow-mindedness. Thus, Hesperialism defends the idea of a Europe that, on the one hand, is strong enough to protect the individual nation state against the rise of China, the demographic explosion of Africa, the difficult relationship with Russia, and the radicalization of the Near East. But on the other hand, such a Europe will only find acceptance if it remains loyal to the historical traditions of the West, instead of fighting them in the name of a chimeric multicultural universalism. Hence, its pillars would be a defense of the natural family, a severe regulation of immigration, the return to natural law, a protection of a socially responsible economic model, a radical implementation of subsidiarity, a reinvigoration of the cultural roots of our identity, and a renewal of our sense of beauty. Given the current situation, this may seem a vain hope, and yet there are more and more signs inspiring some forms of optimism. In the private sphere, for example, we see signs, especially among younger people, that the values often received from parents of the 1968 generation are increasingly perceived as inadequate, since their social, political, and cultural projects and promises have turned out stale, even harmful. Admittedly, the number of those who consciously decide to return to Christian transcendence and cultural tradition is still small and in sore need of guidance. And it has been with this problem in mind that I had recently published a short breviary entitled "What is to be done?", now also published in Spanish, where I try to outline how it could be possible, even in the midst of our current civilizational decline, to remain true to our conservative ideals. But it is becoming increasingly clear that relativism, materialism, and nihilism will not, in spite of everything, be as completely victorious in the coming generations as it might have seemed only a few years ago. With the consolidation and radicalization of the current culture of death, the advocates of the culture of life are also reorganizing themselves, and perhaps with a greater understanding of its timeless significance than in many earlier centuries. But even in the field of political struggle, all hope is not yet lost. On the one hand, the threatening accumulation of various external and internal potential for conflict, be it economic, political, social, demographic, ecological, or ethno-cultural, is leading to an increasing awareness among many citizens about the gravity of the situation and the need for fundamental rethinking of our society. Though, for the moment, this awareness is often exploited by those who created the above-mentioned problems in the first place. Nevertheless, be it social polarization, the paralysis of political institutions, the risk of seeing the Christian population in big cities becoming minority groups, the disastrous consequences of the overexploitation of our environment, the failure of the education system, the hideous banalization of abortion and euthanasia, the risks of transhumanism or the moral corruption induced by the omnipresent cult of consumption, it is becoming increasingly clear to everyone that our civilization is in a state of dangerous imbalance, and that the solution cannot be a leisurely keep calm and carry on, but only a fundamental reset. It should be our aim to demonstrate that such a reset cannot be guaranteed by those responsible for the crisis, but only by return to the values which for centuries guaranteed Europe's success. However, who should and could bring about such a conversion when the already existing so-called Christian political parties have increasingly abandoned their core beliefs, whilst the so-called populist parties have only few constructive solutions to offer apart from a painful but true enumeration of our society's numerous failures? Well, for some years now, the insight has been gradually emerging that those who want to protect the Christian essence of the West must do so not only at the national, but also at the European level. A typical example of this is the role model the Visegrad states could play, which, through their close cooperation and common emphasis on the Christian heritage, are showing that there is an alternative to the extremes of narrow nation states and Eurocentric universalism. The developments of the coming years are likely to intensify this tendency, as we will witness, as is generally expected, a restructuring of the European conservative parties and a possible extension of the Visegrad sphere within the framework of the Trimarium project. Thus, in view of the steadily growing crisis of Western Europe, it can hardly be ruled out that in a few years' time, the East could become the continent's new anchor of stability, thus shifting many other parameters. The preamble for a Confederation of European Nations, which I have published on behalf of the Polish Intellectuals Association, could be a first indication of the direction into which such a new organization of European cooperation could be tending, the model for which would lie more in the subsidiarity and the transcendent self-legitimation of the Holy Roman Empire than in Jacobin centralism and laicity. Even though many people are yet to realize it, the era of the classical parties is definitely over. As the meteoritic rise of Donald Trump and of his antithesis, the current French president, as well as the increasing disintegration of the classical center-left and center-right parties have amply demonstrated. In the face of the obvious failure of representative party democracy, the citizens' discontent with a ponderous and ideologically mostly interchangeable party apparatus is growing, while at the same time the longing for immediate human role models is growing. Of course, this development is not without danger when we consider the confusion which can easily be caused by the attraction exerted by charismatic personalities in times of crisis. But at the same time, such a shift in political tactics has also great potential for a rapid transformation of societal structures, which may still seem unchangeable from today's perspective. How can such a goal be achieved? While the East of Europe will probably maintain much of its democratic institutions, it is to be expected that the West will witness an impressive meltdown of traditional party democracy, and that the political conflicts will not anymore be settled within the parliaments, but rather between increasingly aggressive armed groups in the streets and between rival networks of media, while the state institutions as such will become more or less powerless outside of some strategic areas such as the city centers. In this fight, the Visegrad states could become an important asset to all Western conservative forces and a power base where resistance, reorganization, and active expansion can be organized. Whoever will show his ability to create law and order among the different parallel societies into which our civilization is fragmenting, and whoever will manage to assert the dominance of his ideological narrative within the media will then become the most credible candidate for the people, as well as for the big economic players, in order to assure stability, peace, and continuing profits, and will thus be endowed with the power to implement this new order, a power guaranteed by regular plebiscitary popular support, while the parliamentary game will fade into a merely superficial confirmation of the real power structures behind this facade. Once this general tendency is accepted as inevitable, an acceptance very far from being an easy process as the realities described above are all but ideal, it would be our duty as conservatives to ensure that this evolution is placed under the auspices of a renewal of traditional Christian values, and is meticulously prepared already now in order to create the necessary political as well as cultural conditions. Most important of all, we need to educate a wholly new generation of responsible future state leaders embodying this new ideal and capable of making responsible use of the occasions the upheavals of the next years will doubtlessly offer in order to further a conservative and Christian agenda. Only then can we expect the advent of a new Augustan age of European history, which would bring Christianity back to its place of social, political, and cultural prominence, exactly as Augustus restored the declining Roman religion 2000 years ago. Of course, for the time being, these prospects are still vague visions of the future, and dangerous ones at that. Dangerous because it is to be expected that the coming months and years will not be marked by a peaceful internal reorientation of the European citizens. Rather, they will see an uncontrolled explosion of the by now sheer overwhelming mass of problems, conflicts, and aggressions which have accumulated. The frequency and violence of the riots, which are regularly shaking up the major Western cities, will gradually increase. And because of the inadequate political, psychological, and institutional defense mechanisms of our civilization, they will soon become endemic and omnipresent until the cup of misery is finally drained. And of course, the more our current political elite loses its control over public affairs, the more the denunciation and repression against those actively defending a conservative outlook will also increase. Nevertheless, and despite the difficult times to come, we should always keep in mind the possibilities which may soon be offered to us by the dynamics of the events currently unfolding, and pledge our energy to analyze and steer this development in such a way that at least the worst is prevented. To achieve this, however, it is necessary not only to make the right political choices, but also to actively embody our own ideals in everyday life by drawing on the spirit of Christian faith and Western tradition in all our deeds and words. Only then can we be considered as examples by all those who have lost their spiritual orientation and re-implement Western Christian identity as much as is still possible in the heart of our continent and our fellow citizens. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, concerning immigration, I'm quite convinced by the fact that the integration of culturally strange or different groups, such as essentially, of course, Muslim immigration, will be much easier in a Christian framework, in a more Christian conservative framework, traditionalist framework, than in the current multiculturalist, laicist, universalist framework. Because this actual framework doesn't permit any form of integration. To the contrary, it triggers quite a lot of resistance by people immigrating to Europe, fearing to lose their identity and finally becoming exactly what Christianity has become in the meanwhile. And so, of course, they rather harden their own identity instead of softening it up and opening it up to Christianity and our European civilization. So I think that integration could be much more easy in a more conservative framework, because we not only do we share quite a lot of common values between Islam and Christianity, and I think that probably most Christians think that they share more values with a Muslim than with a hedonist atheist, but also would this give strong limits of what is permitted, what is not permitted, and thus also give a more tangible ground for integration or rejection. So I'm quite optimistic concerning this, and I do not see also any form of inner contradiction between a more regulative and perhaps more severe immigration regime and our Christian ideals, as it is, of course, very clear, even also from the New Testament, that, of course, something that the notion of the Ordo Caritatis is something that is really important already to early Christianity. That is, that love your neighbor doesn't necessarily mean you have to love the person that is farthest from you and ignore those who are around you, but to the contrary, rather that there is some form of hierarchically organized form of charity. So that, I think, is a well-established form of thought stemming already from early Christianity that would give a perfect ground also for the regulation of immigration. I'm not generally considered as an expert on hope, fear, but I think we should perhaps separate different fields. It is clear that on a purely individual level, history always continues. I mean, even the people living in the dark centuries, the fall of Rome and so forth, were not necessarily aware of the fact that the whole civilization was crumbling and that they reverted in only a couple of generations from a highly civilized world into near Stone Age. I'm a bit simplifying, but basically that's what happened. So people did not necessarily were aware about that because, well, this happened, but on the other hand, people married, they had children, they were perhaps happy having feast time, sometimes landscape was beautiful. So that there could be an individual approach that could be extremely happy in the midst of general desolation. So that is always a possibility we have from an individual point of view. Then there's of course the religious point of view. We all know, at least as Christians, that this world is not everything, to the contrary, that the really important things are just starting. On the other side, and so that all this is in some way a gigantic game, you could say, or play in which we have to develop our true identity and show our commitment, of course, our choice, be it for what is good, truth, and beautiful, or for the other side. So that is, of course, also a more absolute perspective already pressed by people like St. Augustine when he makes this differentiation also between the earthly city and the divine city. But there's always a but, of course. There is also the question of civilizations, and it has become it was already extremely clear even to people in classical antiquity, and has then been continued as a thought throughout the entire Middle Ages and until people like Spengler or Toynbee, that civilizations as such are also mortal beings, and that it is also clear that we are approaching for the moment the final phase of the life of the Western civilization. That doesn't mean that everything we know will crumble from one day or the other. To the contrary, the end of a civilization is rather the beginning of a phase of sclerosed, petrified existence, exactly such as the Roman Empire also continued to live in a petrified state for quite a number of centuries. And I think that this is more or less what we are confronted with for the moment, and we can see that more and more through the desolidarization of many people with their own civilization. Civilizations do not die because they are destroyed by barbarians coming in, but because people cease to care about them. And that is exactly what is happening for the moment. More and more people, and I'm afraid to say more and more young people also, do not feel that they belong to this Western civilization. When often giving this example, but when I'm teaching at my universities and speaking about the 19th century or even the beginning of the 20th century, this has become so strange and so far to many of my students that basically they feel more or less the same commitment to this heritage than when I'm speaking about the Aztecs or the ancient Egyptians. That's more or less on the same plane. They have become detached from their own civilization. It's not their heritage anymore. They do not care about that. Of course, they are happy that things function more or less, but they do not feel responsible for that. They view it probably also as some form of weight on their shoulders. They do not want to take over, and certainly they do not want to take that weight to give that weight to any future generations. They have been taught in school also all these lies, from white guilt through toxic masculinity to gender identity or whatever. So they're thoroughly disgusted finally by this view of their own civilization, and so they reject it. And that is how Western civilization slowly dies. Of course, it's a process that has already started a long time ago. It's not just the last generation. It's something that was already in the air, you could say, at the end of the 19th century with the décadence and fin de siècle and so on, but it continues, it becomes worse. And one day there won't be anyone left to care for this civilization. And if nobody feels really responsible for that, then of course, if nobody takes responsibility, if nobody is ready to sacrifice himself or his interests for a greater good, not just for their family lives, but also for greater ideals, and they are intrinsically linked to our civilization, then of course this psychological transformation can very quickly also lead to political transformations. And we are already witnessing this in everyday life, as most Western European countries at least are led by people who do not care at all about this Western civilization, and who for decades now have implemented a politics that is absolutely detrimental to not only to the spiritual identity, but even to the basic material interest, long-term interest of this civilization. And so from this point, viewed from this point, of course, the perspectives, our perspective on the future is quite bleak, and I do not see any reason for believing from that point of view in any positive transformation, as history makes it thoroughly clear that all civilizations die sooner or later, and that we, after 1,000 years of European civilization, from the Carolingians to today, are more or less also now in the final phase. Expert in decline. Yeah, I rather see the parallels between the present moment not with the end of the Roman Empire or even Constantinople. No, I rather think that we are situated at the end of the Roman Republic. We are at the end of the 1st century BC, and we will witness not only the civil unrest or civil wars in our form, of course, in our Western form of our Western civilization, but also the transformation into this final petrified, probably even imperial existence of the Roman Empire. And that can last, of course, for a couple of centuries. And it's not only parallels with the late Republic, we can also draw quite a lot of convincing parallels with other periods in the history of big civilizations. So that is for the question about Constantinople, as I said, rather the late Republic. Concerning our successor, there must not necessarily be a successor. I mean, if you look at civilization, at other past civilizations like the Iranian civilization, which died after the Sasanians, while the territory was taken over by the Muslim civilization in the 7th, 8th century AD, which took over, of course, also a certain number of their civilizational exploits, but after the end of a civilization, it is not necessary that on the same territory we will have a young one. It can also be just a void for many centuries. Civilization happens mostly history happens mostly also outside of civilization. Civilizations, you could say, are an exception within the frame of history. They arise in a certain territory, they maintain themselves for 1,000 years or so. Then they disappear again, they form some form of historical stratum, petrified layer that can be then taken over by others who would rise in another part of the world, or perhaps also nowhere. So we do not necessarily need a successor, and for the moment I do not necessarily also see any candidate. Perhaps one day, who knows, there will be a new civilization rising in Africa, perhaps in Russia. Who knows? It's difficult to predict.
And the gentleman, el señor en sí, ahí atrás.
¿Puedo quitarme la mascarilla o...?
I can just join José María in his also in his thanks for the organizers, for our discussion leader, for you all, of course, of being here. I think this will be a tremendously interesting 3 days, and I'm really happy that that kind of discussion is possible. And I just talked about that also at the beginning with the organizers. Not only such a university, but also such a conference with such a subject and so difficult presentations as ours is already difficult, if not impossible, in a couple of European countries by now. You couldn't organize this in Germany, for example, without having quite a lot of important problems of people outside who would like to storm in or make some problems. And I'm not exaggerating. So I'm really happy that this is still possible in Spain, and happy that such a university system can exist, because this is exactly what we need in Europe. We need to share our ideals of a Christian Western civilization with young people, and to form this new generation, because we have to insist, I think, on one point. As conservatives, we often think that we are 5% of us or so have to fight against the rest of the 95% of the other citizens, but this is not true, because more or less 90% of them don't care anyway about anything. So they, unfortunately, they follow what the media are explaining to them. So our antagonists are not 95% of people, but the other 5% on the other side. So this is the antagonist. Of course, this antagonist controls most of the media, of the academy, of the politics, and so forth. But it is not as if this is an absolutely unequal battle. So it is essentially a battle about the hearts of the people, and I'm quite sure that should through one way or the other, things like media or education system have the possibility of for 5 or even for a year or two to convey also a more conservative content, that probably these 90% of people who are currently absolutely disinterested in following leftist liberal ideals would suddenly start, probably without even noticing it, to restitute or to render our content. So there is some possibility, of course, of restoring Europe and the West to its true identity, its true glory, and it goes essentially not anymore only through politics, but through academics, through media, through schools, through our personal example. And so it's really wonderful to witness this here in Spain. So thank you very much for giving us some hope also here.